Assalamu alaikum and greetings to you all. This is Sabina Victor, the CEO of Impart and your presenter for today's session. Let me begin my presentation by going down the memory lane to my childhood. My mother was a school teacher and she taught English to the primary level students. She often used storytelling technique with animations to draw the attention of the students. Every night, she would read bedtime stories to my siblings and I would create images of the scenes in my mind. Sometimes my mother would narrate stories without a storybook. Her strategy would help us to develop imagery, learn new words, sentence structures, and pronunciation of words. Her favorite stories were Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks and Three Bears. I can never forget how she would change her voice for the dialogue. Grandma, what do you have? Etc. And those stories have been my favorite children's stories. The construction of stories and its narration was an example of today's topic, that is Dictogloss. So moving on. Now, Dictogloss is an ESL game or an activity that focuses on more than one skill at a time. It pushes your students to integrate their knowledge and improve their English ability. In this activity, the teacher reads a passage and the students work together to reconstruct and write it down. How does Dictogloss work? The teacher reads a passage at a natural pace, and students listen and take notes of keywords and phrases. Then they work either in pairs or in groups to reconstruct the passage. The goal of Dictogloss is to improve students' listening, note-taking, and grammar skills by focusing on content, organization, and accuracy. The role of the teacher is to facilitate their learning by initially reading the passage and later provide a correct version for comparison and discussion. Moving on. Now, there are some differences between dictation and Dictogloss. Now, dictation is a useful activity which is employed by teachers for assessing the students' memory and writing skills. As I mentioned yesterday in my session that was about running dictation. At the same time, it can also be used to teach spelling, pronunciation, listening, and comprehension skills, whereas Dictogloss requires students to be active or pay attention to the grammatical features which are presented by the teacher as he or she reads a text, a passage from a novel or from any other source, which I will be telling you later on. Now, in dictation, the teachers usually read a text several times. Normally, it is twice or thrice, it depends. And students are expected to write down the exact sentences, um, and to make sure that they have the accurate passage or the text in written form. Whereas Dictogloss is a bit different. In Dictogloss, students actually pay a close attention to the passage which is read by the teacher. And when the teacher is reading the passage, they are supposed to focus on the reading and not jot down the words or the phrases. After the reading is done, the students then are told by the teacher to work either in pairs or groups to reconstruct the paragraph, the text, or the passage in their own words. Moving on. Now, there are various examples of dictogloss, and you must be wondering what are those examples? How a teacher can, what type of dictogloss text or examples can they be for this particular type of activity? First one is short stories. You can choose a short story, such as a news article or a poem, and read it aloud to the students and ask them to work in pairs and groups and reconstruct the text from their memory. And after they do this task, the next task is to compare it with the original text and to discuss what differences do they see in terms of the information, not in terms of the words, because they're using their own words to reconstruct the, the text. Next is dialogues. You can also use dialogues from a play, a movie, or a TV show for your students, provided that they are familiar with those TV shows or movies. And what you can do is with those dialogues, you can again make them work either in pairs or groups and ask them to reconstruct that dialogue from their memory. Or you can also ask them, you can bring in a little bit, you can make it interesting by engaging your students in short role plays. That is, by making them act it out, in order to show what are their versions of the dialogues in front of the whole class. Moving on. You can also use storytelling, like how I had given you at the beginning of the presentation. Example of the Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks and the Three Bears. In the same way, depending upon the level, the class, or the grade of your students, you can also use storytelling technique by creating animations, gestures, or facial expressions that will make it more interesting for the students to pay attention to you. And when you finish reading a certain portion of the text from that novel or storybook, you can ask them again to work in pairs or groups, or even instead of writing, you can also ask the students to retell the stories in their own words. And then you can compare their version with the original version just to see have they somewhat deviated from the original story or not. Moving on. Next is vocabulary building. You can also choose a set of words or structures or phrases that you want your students to learn. You can read a short text that has the targeted words or phrases that you want them to become familiar with. And then you ask your students to work either in pairs and groups and reconstruct those phrases, those keywords from their memory. and just to see whether they have used those words or phrases in their sentences correctly. Next. You can also target grammar practice. That is, if you want your students to improve their grammar, you can also have a text that focuses on grammar, such as the tenses, active passive voice. And once you read a text that has the targeted grammar topic, you can ask the students to replicate either in a verbal or written form, just to make sure to see that whether they have used that particular topic, that is either tenses, active, passive, or any direct, indirect, in the correct form or not. Next. Now, there are various types of dictogloss texts. And what are those types? Let's see. First is a news article. If you wish to make your students familiar with news article or certain words, you can choose an article that is interesting for your students, that will also draw their attention towards the activity. But make sure that the article which you choose should be around 150 to 200 words. Next is a poem. You can choose a poem which is not difficult but easy to understand, and it has some literary value, something from which they can learn a lesson. And the poem should be around 10 to 15 lines long. Next, dialogues. You can also choose a short dialogue from a popular movie or TV show, something which your students already know, and the dialogue should be around 10 to 15 lines. All right, and I'm sorry for the typo on the screen. Moving on. Fairy tales. You can also select a short fairy tale that is familiar, like how my mother had used what I shared with you earlier. That is Little Red Riding Hood and Goldilocks and Three Bears. That's why I remember it till today, because of the way she taught me the techniques of how to improve my English language skills. So in the same way, you can use the same skills with your students. But remember that the stories or the fairy tales which you use should be around 150 to 200 words long. Next. Social media posts. Then you can choose a short post from social media, that is either Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, something which has correct English in it, not which has mistakes. Otherwise, your students will learn those mistakes and they will incorporate them in their verbal and written skills. So the post should be around 50 to 100 words long. Next. Letter or email. Then you can also select a letter or an email that is relevant to your students, which is grade appropriate, which is also language appropriate, and something which is interesting for them. And the letter or email, therefore, should be around 100 to 150 words long. Now, there are ways of implementing a Dictogloss activity, and those ways are: you can select a short text that is appropriate for your students' language level and interest. Next is, you can, if you want them to learn certain vocabulary, just make sure that you teach them that vocabulary beforehand, so that if you want them to use that vocabulary to create a paragraph or a two, so they should know that the words that they're using are correct and they're relevant. And it will also help them to understand what they are working on. In other words, it will also help them in reconstructing it from memory. Moving on, read aloud, a very good technique that you can practice with you can do with your students, but make sure that when you are reading aloud, it should be at a natural pace. Natural pace means a pace where your students can listen to the words clearly. Because if you read fast, your students will miss out on the key words or information. And if they ask you to repeat the reading, then please do it for their convenience. And I'm sure you must be doing it in your classrooms. Moving on. Reconstruction of text. Now, when you make your students work either in pairs or groups, make sure that they focus on the main ideas and the key details. And tell them that they are not supposed to copy the exact words that you had read to them. The whole purpose of Dictogloss is actually to check the students' memory and understanding, just to see whether they were paying attention to you or not, whether they have understood what you were reading out to them. So that's the purpose of Dictogloss activity. Then is compare and discuss. After your students have finished with the reconstruction of the text, the next step is to encourage them to compare their version of the text with the original version, and also to see where they have made mistakes in terms of punctuation, in terms of words that they had used, or even maybe the main ideas, in case the main ideas are not in sequence. So this is a good way to encourage them to share it out through a discussion. Next, reflect on language use. Then after the task has been completed, the final task should be that the students should reflect or share their experience of what they went through when they were listening to you while you were reading the passage. What did they experience when they were working in pairs or groups with their teammates? What were some of the social skills that they had learned? Did they learn to share, care, cooperate, listen attentively? Did they face any problems or challenges or difficulties while they were in the process of completing the task? And if there are any differences in their version of the text and the original, so then you can ask them to explain it. But in this reflection also, your support is needed. And these reflections actually will tell you how far or how successful your Dictogloss activity has gone. Next. Now, I'm going to share with you a sample Dictogloss activity which I had done with my students. And this was Dictogloss for secondary students, and the grade that I had worked with was class 8. And I had given them a time limit of 25 to 30 minutes. And the novel which I had used was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. And it was chapter 17, that is The Man with Two Faces. Then what I made them do was, I had read out the paragraph from page 313 of the textbook. Plus, I had also given them the keywords like Professor Quirrell, Lord Voldemort, Stone from Gringotts, Good and Evil, and Faithfully. And the students, when I was reading this paragraph, they were listening to me. I had told them to listen carefully and not to write. And after the reading was done, then I told them to take down the keywords or the names. And after that, I made them work in pairs. So this is the original text that I had given to my students. And this was taken from page 313 of Harry Potter. And now comes the reconstruction part. So this is what my students had worked in pairs, and this is what they reconstructed the text. And you can see for yourself. Professor Quirrell confesses about the presence of Lord Voldemort to Harry. Both men were inseparable because Lord Voldemort had taken refuge in Professor Quirrell's body. Together, they traveled round the world, and Voldemort somewhat brainwashed Professor Quirrell about good and evil, and he made him believe both qualities never existed, but only power. The weakest stood no choice. Since that time, Professor Quirrell had been faithful to Voldemort and became his servant. He also admitted that he had let down Voldemort. However, Voldemort never forgave him easily for his mistakes. And one example was a failed attempt to steal the stone from Gringotts that disappointed Voldemort. And the incident prompted him to keep a close watch on Professor Quirrell. Isn't that wonderful? You see, the main ideas are there in the reconstruction. And you can see that this entire text has been written by the students in their own words, and they have stuck to the names that were given to them by me, that is Professor Quirrell, Lord Voldemort, good and evil, and as well as where faithfully was changed into faithful, but it's okay. But as long as the main ideas matched with the original text. So they did a wonderful job over here. So moving on. Next I come to is the factors to consider for Dictogloss assessment. The first is teaching goals. Now, Dictogloss activities can be used to develop listening, speaking, writing, as well as collaborative and critical thinking skills. If your teaching goals include the skills, it will be beneficial to assess Dictogloss activities to gauge your students' progress. Assessment framework. Consider the assessment framework used in your classroom. If you use formative assessment approach, Dictogloss activities can provide feedback on your students' strengths and weaknesses. If you use summative assessment approach, then you need to align your Dictogloss activity with the assessment criteria and include it in the final grade. Next is feedback. Assessing Dictogloss activities can provide an opportunity to give feedback to your students on their language use, critical thinking skills, and collaboration skills. Providing feedback can motivate your students to improve and help achieve their learning goals. And last but not the least is time constraints. Consider the time constraints of your classroom. If you have limited time for assessment, you may need to prioritize other assessment tasks over Dictogloss activities. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. If you have questions or queries, you are most welcome to comment down below on YouTube, or you can get in touch with me through WhatsApp if you are familiar with my WhatsApp number. So even then too, I'm very active on YouTube. I check the comments and I do try to reply instantly. So thank you for taking out your precious time to watch this presentation. I hope you will be able to use Dictogloss activity in your classroom with your students. So till then, take good care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.